a byproduct of the mitochondria doing its work as the engine of the cell is oxidative stress. Too much oxidative stress leads to less optimal health, inflammation, cancer, dementia, diabetes, learning disabilities.
In the evening, melatonin is released from the pineal gland. And we've all heard that melatonin can help us sleep. People take melatonin as a sleep supplement. I know it's important for that, but you're saying it also goes into the mitochondria of our cells and combats oxidative stress?
That's exactly correct.
Okay, so that process works at night. How do mitochondria in our cells deal with oxidative stress during the day?
Well, that's a very good question, because any type of light that hits the human eye is going to shut down the production of melatonin from the pineal gland. And so there has to be a completely different system that is put in place during the day that allows melatonin to be made in the mitochondria to deal with the oxidative stress. Infrared radiation from the sun, which we'll talk about, actually goes into the mitochondria and is producing melatonin on site. This is what the science is now starting to discover, making it very interesting as to how much sunlight are we getting and what happens when we don't get enough sunlight. As we look here at the solar spectrum, you'll see that 39%, just 39% of the energy coming from the sun is in the form of visible light. And we can see that here between 400 nanometers and 760 nanometers wavelength. You can see everything to the right of red is known as infrared because it has a wavelength longer than red. And that is divided up into near infrared and far infrared. At the other end, all of the light, as you can see, that is beyond the purple or violet in this case, ultraviolet is not seen, but we know that it's important. Specifically, UVB is important in making vitamin D. But I want you to notice something very important. 54% of all the energy coming from the sun is in the infrared spectrum. One of the things that's really important is understanding what lux is. And so we've got an example here where we have a candle, which is 1 lumen, 1 meter away from a board, which is 1 meter by 1 meter, and that's described as 1 lux. And in this slide here, you can see that 1 lux is kind of like twilight at night, and that a family living room is about 50 lux, but it can go all the way up to 1,000 if you had an overcast day outside. And if it was a bright and sunny day, that would be around 100,000 or even more lux. And so that kind of gives you an idea when we talk about exposing your eyes to light at a certain lux level. This is a good reference point for understanding light and its intensity. The human body is extremely complex. And because of that, there are so many processes that are occurring that it's not just one continuous thing. There are times of the day where certain things tend to happen and times of the day when other things don't. So I wanted to show you here what I'm referring to, and just to give you an example of what we talked about with oxidative stress, we can see here that melatonin secretion starts at 2100. That's about 9 o'clock at night. We call that dim light melatonin onset, because if you are watching dim light, then it's going to basically start to secrete melatonin from the pineal gland. But if you notice, as we go around this cycle, melatonin will stop at approximately 7:30 in the morning. Dim light melatonin onset is kind of a bad name for it because really it's the absence of light that allows the pineal gland to stimulate and produce and secrete melatonin throughout the blood and the human body. You're right that it may not be 9 o'clock in everybody, and that's the problem, is this circadian rhythm has to fit onto reality. This is a clock that's going on inside your body. But the problem can come in is if your clock is not in tune with what reality is on the outside. In other words, there's a certain part of your body, your circadian rhythm, that's attuned to when you should be awake. And if it's not correlating with when the sun is up, you might have some problems. So yes, the circadian rhythm, which is very finely regulated inside the body, but the question is it actually in line with what's happening outside the body, what reality is? There's been a number of studies that have been done both in rodents and in humans that when they apply the dysregulation of the circadian rhythm in rodents, we can see problems with body temperature, increased fat, altered immune system, tumor developments, and basically just perturbations of the hormonal homeostasis. In human beings, when they do this prospectively, they show that there are problems with insulin regulation, leptin, and norepinephrine, and also increased markers of inflammation and diabetes. When light hits the eye and specifically goes to the retina, and I want to specifically say that we know that light that goes to the retina is hitting rods and cones, and those go to neurons, which then project back here to the occipital lobe, and that's where we actually can understand and visualize and see things. There is light that we see that we can describe. What I'm about to talk to you about is light that comes into the eye that goes to a completely different part of the brain, and it's not light that you're conscious of. It's light that you're unconscious of. This light that's coming into the eye is not going to rods and cones, but instead this thing called intrinsically photosensitive retinal ganglion cells. Now, these are ganglia. They are particularly in the inferior portion of the retina at the back of the eye, and that's important to understand because usually light that comes from the superior visual field when it hits the lens is going to be projected down into the inferior retina. So this is going to be stuff in the superior visual field. It is then projected to something called the suprachiasmatic nucleus. Now, this is the master clock. This is the portion of the brain that makes sure that everything is working in sync. When light comes in, it's telling the suprachiasmatic nucleus that it is daytime, that it is during the day, that this must be coming from the sun. This is how we are hardwired. And because of that, there is a specific neuron that shuts down production in the pineal gland of melatonin. Obviously, it's possible for you to be out of sync. So the question then becomes, how does the brain and the circadian rhythm inside your brain adjust to reality? So I want to show you how the circadian rhythm in your brain can be shifted one way or the other, depending on the external sources of light. So I want you to imagine that you're on a desert island, that you have no sort of extrinsic sources of light, and you're perfectly aligned. You can see here that the night of the circadian rhythm is actually aligned with night, which is reality, and also the daytime is perfectly aligned with reality, which is day. That's the ideal. In our situation, if we were to, for instance, expose our eyes to the screen or our iPhone or anything like that, what could happen is that we would start to expose our eyes to light at a time where we would not normally be experiencing light. And so what the circadian rhythm wants to do in that situation is it's thinking that it's still daytime. And as a result of that, it's going to shift itself over to that to encompass and capture that because it thinks that it's too early. And so you can see here very clearly that exposure to light at night after the sun goes down has a tendency to delay your circadian rhythm. Now, that can cause problems, as we've talked about before, but the biggest problem that you might notice yourself consciously is that even though you're at night here, your circadian rhythm is not ready for sleep. And so you might actually get the symptom of insomnia. And also, similarly, it's day here at the beginning, and you're still in the middle of your sleep. And so you might get hypersomnia in the morning. And you can see here that it's important to understand that avoiding light, especially late in the circadian rhythm, after the sun has gone down before you go to bed, avoiding it can prevent this type of shifting from occurring. Interestingly also, is exposing your eyes to light here in the beginning of the day can help anchor your circadian rhythm and prevent it from sliding later and later because of viewing of light in the late hours. You'll notice that light is coming in and it's the inferior portion as we talked about. So it's really important to avoid bright light, especially high up in your visual field. So ceiling lights, things of that nature. I would say if you had to use lights, using lighting on the floor or using lighting low on the wall, those night light types of thing would be much better. Also realize that the peak sensitivity of those intrinsically photosensitive retinal ganglion cells are around 460 to 484 nanometers, which is basically in the blue section. Now, you may have heard of blue blockers and even programs on your screens and computers that can reduce the amount of blue light, because this is the type of light that specifically is going to excite those intrinsically photosensitive retinal ganglion cells. It's any kind of light that's really going to stimulate it. It's just this blue light that seems to be the worst at stimulating those ganglion receptors. And remember, when they do, they're going to tell the suprachiasmatic nucleus, as we've shown here, to shut down melatonin production. And the point is that melatonin is the coolant that makes sure that the engine is running smoothly and that antioxidants are kept to a minimum. So you really want to have that melatonin production at night, and you don't want light shutting it down. In addition to projecting to the suprachiasmatic nucleus, which regulates the circadian rhythm, they also project to another part of the brain, which has nothing to do with vision, called the perihabenular nucleus. And as you can see here, it is completely separate from the suprachiasmatic nucleus, but it is involved with mood. And so this is something that we see a lot of in the wintertime when people become depressed. And this is known as SAD, or seasonal affective disorder. This is one of the manifestations of not enough light getting to this area of the brain. Kyle, about 5% of the population get symptoms of seasonal affective disorder. And symptoms appear in these patients about 40% of the year. We typically see it more in females versus males. But when they did a meta-analysis of all of these studies that looked at light in these patients, about 173 studies that were identified, randomized placebo-controlled trials looking at the DSM diagnosis, and about 20 studies they showed something very interesting, that when they were exposed to bright light at about 3,000 lux hours, so that would be 10,000 lux for about 20 minutes in the morning, and they did it for at least 4 days, they were able to show very conclusively that overall with this meta-analysis, there was an improvement in the seasonal affective disorder with bright light. Another way of doing this is something called dawn stimulation. You can see here on the chart that increasing light exposure automatically in your bedroom from about 0 initially to about 200 to 300 lux over a 1 to 2.5 hour period of time can also improve seasonal affective disorder, as we can see here again with this meta-analysis, where overall there was an effect size on these patients. So it's slowly bringing the lights up, and there's actually lights that you can program to do this sort of thing. In 2017, this paper was published looking at can proper light therapy affect bipolar depression. And this study showed that in 46 patients, which were randomized to placebo versus 7,000 lux bright white light versus 50 lux dim red placebo light, around 12 o'clock to 2:30 in the afternoon, 15 minutes per day, and then building up to 1 hour per day by week 4, you can see here that by week 4, there was a significant increase in the patients that were in remission from bipolar depression. That's a good thing. As the number goes up, that was good. And you can see that as the amount of light that was given to the patient increased after week 4, there was a much higher percentage of patients that were in remission who got the 7,000 lux bright white light in the afternoon. There was a paper that was published in 2010 that looked at artificial dawn for 2 weeks, 250 lux or 50 lux versus control. And what they saw was a significant reduction in sleep inertia. In other words, it was easier to get up. You weren't feeling like you were tired and you wanted to stay in bed. In the 50 lux and the 250 lux versus no dawn at all. And you can see here that very similar intervention, the dawn stimulating light, when they did this for 30 minutes prior to waking up and then 20 minutes after waking up, compared to a very small amount of light, they were able to show that this dawn simulating light improved subjective well-being, mood, and actually cognitive performance as compared with the dim light and the minimal blue light that they had as controls. I would just say, though, that this artificial light, this dawn simulating light, is really just a way of capturing what you would normally have if you were to go outside and expose your eyes to bright light outside early in the morning. So all of this is really to show that stimulating your eyes with bright light from the sun is very beneficial. Bright light is a strong stimulus for cortisol levels coming up in the morning. Again, another reason why you want to have bright light stimulation early in the morning when you're getting up, because that allows the cortisol levels to come up, and that's going to time the melatonin levels later in the evening. So remember that cortisol is a very important hormone. It's a steroid hormone. It goes into the cells, goes into the nucleus, and controls about 20% of the genome of your DNA. And so that if you have chronic stress, also remember that chronic stress increases cortisol levels above what they should be, and that can cause problems on down the road. So you want to have enough cortisol, you want to have it at the right time, and you don't want too much of that cortisol. And so again, another important reason why you want to have bright light exposure in the morning to anchor the circadian rhythm and to make sure your cortisol levels are coming up at the right time. There was a paper that was published in 2015. What they measured was the irradiance of the ebook versus the print book. And you can see here we have irradiance on the y-axis, and we have it broken down into wavelengths. What we have here up top is the ebook, and you can see clearly that, especially in the blue range, there's quite a lot of irradiance coming out at that point. What you probably might have a hard time seeing is because it's so low, is looking at a print book in regular light. And you can see clearly that there's a huge difference in the irradiance between the ebook and the regular print book. So again, it would be better for you to read at night using a regular print book. If you look at sleep latency, which is the time it takes for somebody to fall asleep, you'll see that it was much longer in those who were watching the ebook than those who were reading the book in dim light. In the study, it also showed that those subjects that were reading with the ebook felt more sleepy the next day when they got up. In other words, they had more sleep inertia. Let's summarize exactly what the recommendations are. Number 1, in the morning, view sunlight as soon after waking up as possible, ideally before 9 o'clock in the morning. Look, there's nothing better than going outside as the sun is coming up. There is much more light outside than you're ever going to be able to generate inside. But if you have an issue where the sun is not up or it's very cloudy where you live, you can aim for about 10,000 lux. Spend about 20 to 30 minutes a day in the morning. You want to be anywhere between 11 and 15 inches from the light box. So that's one option. But again, nothing beats actually going outside. Remember when we talked about lux, that on a bright sunny day, it's about 100,000 lux. So you can get that very, very quickly. Remember that the photoreceptors in the retina in the morning are not very sensitive. So you need to have very bright light to activate it, but it's kind of integrated over time. So if it's not very bright, you have to spend a longer amount of time. If it's very bright, then you don't have to spend much time at all. If you're in very bright light, 30 seconds may be all that you need if it's 100,000 lux. On a cloudy winter day, like we were just talking about, it could take up to 30 minutes. But again, making sure that you're getting your eyes looking at bright light in the morning. You want to avoid sunglasses. You want to avoid windows. And we'll talk a little bit more about this, but especially the low E glass. That's very effective at filtering out infrared light. You don't want windshields. That doesn't really count. You want to get outside and have nothing between you and the light source. Again, avoiding blue blockers. We talked about how blue light stimulation is really key at that time of the day. So make sure that you're getting as much stimulation as possible. In terms of what you should do in the evening time, after the sun goes down, is to limit as much light as possible after sunset. You want to have any kind of light that you have as low as possible. You want to have it as red as possible, and you want to have it as dim as possible so that you can have the benefit of melatonin secretion from the pineal gland when the time is right. Remember what we said, that intrinsically photosensitive retinal ganglion cells are more activated by blue light. So if you have no choice, if you have to do something, it's better to make sure that the blue light aspect is reduced, either by programming it into the computer or by wearing blue blockers, glasses.
Light in the evening, keep it as low as possible, as red as possible, as dim as possible. Avoid screens or use reduced blue light function or wear blue light blocker glasses.
There was this very interesting paper that was published by Scott Zimmerman and Russell Ryder, one of them a professor and the other one a light engineer. But what they said in this article, and these are the highlights, is that melatonin we know is a potent antioxidant and that it's actually produced within the mitochondria in response to sunlight and provides targeted protection of the mitochondria from reactive oxygen species. It's also protective against a wide range of diseases that are identified with mitochondrial dysfunction, including cancers, neurodegenerative diseases, cardiovascular disease, and also diabetes. And it may have a role in the prevention of diabetes, Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease, and even, as we'll talk about, COVID-19.
Infrared radiation from the sun stimulates something called cytochrome C oxidase. And that in turn tells the mitochondria in all of our cells to stimulate melatonin production.
In fact, this is not very well known because this production of melatonin, Kyle, is happening inside the mitochondria. It's taken us a lot of time and energy and technology to be able to detect that type of level. Where we first detected melatonin was in the blood, and that's the backup plan at night. But what we're starting to find out is that melatonin production in the mitochondria is actually the front line cooling system for the mitochondria. As you can see here on this slide, less than 5% of the body's melatonin is produced in the pineal gland, and greater than 95% of the body's melatonin is produced on site in the mitochondria. This is a quote from Zimmerman and Ryder. He says, "It has now been shown that the mitochondria produce melatonin in many cells in quantities which are orders of magnitude higher than that produced in the pineal gland. This subcellular melatonin does not necessarily fluctuate with our circadian clock or release into the circulation system, but instead has been proposed to be consumed locally in the mitochondria in response to free radical density within each cell, in particular in response to near-infrared exposure." Based on an optical and biological review of the literature, it is proposed that the near-infrared portion of natural sunlight, and we'll define that, stimulates an excess of antioxidants, like melatonin, in each of our healthy cells, and that the cumulative effect of this antioxidant reservoir is to enhance the body's ability to rapidly and locally deal with changing conditions throughout the day. In this approach, the role of the circulatory melatonin produced by the pineal gland is to provide an efficient method of delivering supplemental melatonin during periods of low cellular activity, that would be at night, and solar stimulus to damaged or aging cells in both diurnal and nocturnal animals. While circulatory melatonin may be the hormone of darkness, in other words, the pineal gland at night, provided that there's no light hitting the retina. However, subcellular melatonin, that is intramitochondrial melatonin, may be the hormone of daylight. In other words, this intramitochondrial melatonin is a result of the person going out into the sunlight, specifically infrared radiation. Yeah, so near infrared is just an aspect of the entire spectrum of light. Here we see the solar spectrum, and we're specifically looking at near infrared radiation. That is the part from 760 nanometers to 1400 nanometers, and you cannot see this. How you experience near infrared radiation or light from the sun is a feeling of warmth. And that is because this type of light from the sun can penetrate deep into the epidermis, the dermis, and even the subcutaneous tissue, depending on the wavelength. And it's perceived as heat because the transfer of this energy actually stimulates the heat receptors in our skin. And that is how it is felt. You'll often feel this, right? If you're in the sun and your back is to the sun and you've got a shirt on, you'll feel that warmth on the back. That is infrared radiation speaking to you. So the purpose of this slide is to demonstrate that the majority of the energy coming from the sun and hitting the earth is in the infrared spectrum. Here we have infrared on the right side of this black bar. We have the visible spectrum here, and we have ultraviolet over here on the left. And as you can see, if we look at the red envelope here, we'll see that this is the amount of energy that's hitting the earth in the visible spectrum, but all of this red over here, and specifically right up to about 1400, all of this is the amount of energy that is coming through the atmosphere, hitting the earth in the infrared spectrum. So we're dealing with a large amount of energy. If we look at that energy as it hits the skin, notice that wavelengths that are longer tend to penetrate more deeply. The interesting thing about this is that infrared, which is out here, or specifically near infrared, can actually penetrate down, it is estimated, depending on which study you look at, anywhere from 1 centimeter up to 8 centimeters. And as you know, 1 centimeter is twice 5 millimeters. So you can see how deep this could actually go. Regardless of whether or not the skin is melanin rich or not, you can see here that this infrared light was able to penetrate down up to 8 centimeters into the skin. Some is reflected, but the point here is that infrared radiation can penetrate up to 8 centimeters according to some of their studies. And that is a significant amount in terms of depth and the amount of tissue that infrared radiation can actually affect. If we look at this picture here of a hand in visible light reflects off the surface of the skin. But near infrared light, at in this case 810 nanometers, penetrates down deep enough that it actually shows where the veins are under the surface. And this is actually used in the clinical setting to help nurses find veins. What's going on here is that the veins and the blood are absorbing the light and not reflecting it back. And that's how you're able to see these veins that are beneath the surface. What they did in their study is they looked at the number of cells totally in the human body with time. And you can see here that as a child grows, the number of cells in their body increases. In terms of the number of cells that near infrared can reach, because it penetrates so deeply, they were able to show that there's a large amount of cells in the human body that is accessible to near infrared radiation. That as opposed to ultraviolet and visible spectrum, which is down here at the bottom. So near infrared light, even though we can't see it, can penetrate very deeply, and it affects a number of our cells in our body. Of course, as we grow in girth, as we become more obese, for instance, the number of cells that are not able to be reached by near infrared radiation would become more and more. Very interesting to me was that near infrared radiation could even penetrate bone. And what they showed here very elegantly was that near infrared radiation can actually penetrate bone, and that the cerebral spinal fluid that surrounds the brain would diffuse the near infrared radiation and would actually cause the sulci and the gyri, these are sort of the dips and the crevasses in the brain, to trap that near infrared radiation and to reflect it down deep into these caverns so that the gray matter on the surface of the brain could be exposed to near infrared radiation.
So would I need to be actually out in the sun to get near infrared radiation?
No. In fact, Kyle, what this figure shows is that the light that comes from the sun is very rich in near infrared radiation. What's even richer in near infrared radiation is the light that reflects off of the green leaves and the trees and the grass. You see that most blue, green, and red materials have a very high near infrared reflectance. And so actually what's coming to our eyes is light, especially if you're surrounded by greenery, that is very rich specifically in near infrared radiation. So that when we look at the light that's actually coming to the eyes, over 90% of that light that's entering the eye isn't even doing so through the pupil. It's actually going around it because it's able to penetrate through this near infrared radiation, not only the eye, but also the rest of the body. So that what we're seeing is light that is very rich in near infrared radiation, and you actually don't even need to be into the sun. Take a look at these near infrared photographs. You'll see here that it's exactly as I'm talking about. You can see here the leaves, the grass, the plants, they're all bright white, almost like they have snow on them. And that's because they highly reflect near infrared light so well. Here's a picture in Central Park, and you can see that the buildings are basically black because there's no reflectance there of near infrared radiation, but you can see that the leaves and the trees are highly reflective of near infrared radiation, and we're not in the sun here.